My subject today is Benjamin Britten's second string quartet, premiered in 1945. Now, as mentioned at some length in my opening lecture of this series, Benjamin Britten, born a century ago in 1913, began his professional career in the 1930s as a prolific and precocious composer in an eclectic range of genres. Indeed, in practically every field apart from opera. In 1939, a few months before the war was declared, and together with tenor Peter Pears, he went to the USA for a prolonged visit, perhaps even to emigrate. There he wrote and premiered his String Quartet No.1, the first of his works in this genre to be granted an opus number, but preceded by many quartets written in his teenage years. Now, in 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, and despite concerns about the safety of making an Atlantic crossing, Britten and Pears returned home. Worries about the journey aside, they did so with wider-ranging trepidation. During the preceding months, and with his beleaguered homeland in the grip of a total war whose outcome was still far from certain, Britten's absence had sparked a considerable controversy, one that says much about the mood of those uniquely dark and anxious times. Now, the most extended airing of this controversy about Britten took place in late 1941 in the pages of the Musical Times, an august journal that had been in existence for nearly a century. It was initiated under the coy title of An English Composer Goes West by Pilot Officer E.R. Lewis, who, although not mentioning Britten by name, penned a letter to the editor of complaint about the attention given to a certain young composer who had emigrated to the US. Lewis stated that, and here I'm quoting him, "The taking of American citizenship by the group to which he belongs invites mockery of the sociological ideals which it formerly proffered at considerable length." I think when he says sociological, he probably means socialist. The sociological ideals it formerly proffered at considerable length. And I must protest at the continued description of this musician as a British composer when by his own action he disclaims that title, unquote. Well, with those battle lines drawn, a subsequent lengthy correspondence column did little to resolve matters, still less make the debate any less tempered. Composers such as Gerald Cockshott and E.J. Moran wrote in Britten's defense, but they were shouted down by supporters of Lewis, the latter group shored up by heavy-handed editorial interventions that repeatedly reminded readers of the traumas of World War I and the duties of all in the present state of total war. Behind it all, of course, were anxieties by the bucket load, some of them of a remarkably long-standing English pedigree. Anxieties about Britten's homosexuality, for example, and related in most people's minds at that time, anxiousness about his association with Auden and other left-wing characters who had similarly deserted their country in its hour of need. Anxieties about England as a place where music had long flourished, but where embarrassingly few composers of international standing had emerged, and anxieties about the status of art more generally and its relationship to masculine duty. As one saber rattler put it, quote, "If Benjamin Britten's art is to be worthy, he must be a man before he is an artist, ready to accept the risks, responsibilities, and duties of a man," unquote. It cannot have been by chance, again, the Musical Times' editorial bias is obvious, that one tranche of this correspondent in the magazine was then juxtaposed with a lengthy news item about firefighter Dmitri Shostakovich, who was heroically finishing his 7th Symphony in besieged Leningrad. Shostakovich is reported to declare to the world that the cultural workers of Leningrad are doing their duty like other Leningrad citizens, unquote. Now, in this highly charged context, it's small wonder that in the years immediately following Britten's return to England, as he set up home with peers in London and then periodically escaped to deepest Suffolk in order to compose, Britten was careful to foster the rehabilitation of his reputation as an English composer, building bridges whenever possible. Although he registered as a conscientious objector, he and peers on occasions worked hard for CIMA, as it was called, the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, an organization that after the war became the Arts Council. And they often gave of their services, gave concerts in, to put it kindly, less than elevated circumstances. What's more, and ultimately much more important, Britten's major compositions in the remaining war years, among them the Hymn to St. Cecilia, a ceremony of carols, serenade for tenor, horn and strings, all these works display a clear commitment to English traditions. In particular, they explore new ways of imagining the relationship between English words and English music, a relationship that Britten thought had endured centuries-long decline. Now, this last circumstance obviously reappears in his most important work to emerge in these years, an opera that was premiered just as the war was coming to an end. As he admitted, and it was a potent sign of the operatic times, for an impecunious young composer to try to make his way in the world, an operatic project was the height of impracticality. But even before he left the US, Britten had an opera in mind, one based on a poem by Aldborough poet George Crabbe and set in a rough seafaring community. Crucially, he'd been given a modest grant by the conductor Serge Koussevitzky, one that allowed him the extra time he needed to write a large-scale work. This Crabbe opera became, of course, Peter Grimes, which was premiered in London in June 1945. It proved so internationally successful that Britten was able to dedicate much of his future energy to opera, to make it, as he said at the time, his real métier. Now, Grimes is then an important moment in the tortured later 20th century history of opera, but it was also a crucial one in Britten's composing career and the reception of his music, establishing the backdrop against which future works such as his second string quartet would be listened to and assessed. Now, one of the most striking aspects of the early Grimes commentary, for example, is an anxious concern about where Britten stood vis-à-vis his musical heritage in England. Two questions were repeatedly asked. How did he and his opera relate to recent mainland European trends? And also, what was his relationship to national roots? Now, with a little help from the composer himself, answers came there readily, if inconclusively. The first question about what we might call his modernist credentials generated confusion everywhere. Everyone could hear that Grimes was tonal, albeit often ambiguously so, and had few leanings towards atonality or serialism. On the other hand, aspects of the score, not least its 6 orchestral preludes, interludes, its less than elevated subject matter, and its unconventional outsider protagonist, all of these were plainly influenced by such advanced pieces as Berg's Wozzeck. Now, as for the second question, the matter of Britten's Englishness, here the position of Grimes was yet again unclear, mostly because there was virtually no native operatic tradition to refer to. Significantly, Britten himself emphasized the national void preceding him. He declared that part of his task was, quote, to restore to the musical setting of the English language a brilliance, freedom, and vitality that have been curiously rare since the death of Purcell, unquote. A statement that was often quoted approvingly by those favoring modern-day English renaissances. Now, what's more, the harmonic idiom of Peter Grimes often veers into modal writing, in spite of the back to Purcell proclamations, and has reminiscences of much more recent homegrown composers such as Gustav Holst and Ralph Vaughan Williams. Now, it's in this post-Peter Grimes context that the second string quartet emerged, and the piece has many resonances with what we might call the project of the opera. It was commissioned and dedicated to Mary Berend, a close friend at this time, and it was first performed, as I said, in late 1945. It was one of a clutch of works, The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra and the Holy Sonnets of John Donne, are two others, that again celebrated the work of Henry Purcell. Indeed, the Wigmore Hall concert in which the second string quartet received its premiere was in fact a commemoration of the 250th anniversary of Purcell's death. And the composer actually wrote a program note for this concert talking about Purcell. Here's what he said, quote, "Purcell was the last important international figure of English music. Ironically, the continent of Europe has been more aware of his greatness than the island which produced him. But that he should be to the English public little more than a name in history books is not altogether strange, for he is the antithesis of the music which has been popular for so long in this country." Now, fighting words, you might think, but perhaps they can also be read a little bit between the lines. On the one hand, such patriotic celebration of Purcell might seem entirely laudable and was by no means confined to Britain in this period. When the Royal Opera House opened its doors for operatic business in 1946, it had served as a dance hall during the Second World War, when its first fully staged opera was Purcell's The Fairy Queen. On the other hand, though, we might recall that Britten's eulogy of Purcell, which I just quoted, at least in this verbal form, is done at the expense of other more recent composers, figures such as indeed Holst and Vaughan Williams, whose influence Britten presumably felt to be more threatening. Now, whatever the case, the composer announced to its dedicatee that this new quartet, dedicated to Purcell in all sorts of ways, was, quote, "the greatest advance that I've made, and although it is far from perfect, it has given me encouragement to continue on new lines," unquote. So what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is see if we can locate some aspects of the work that might betray that bold assessment and also put the opera a little more firmly into its unusual historical context in 1945. And the first movement is marked Allegro calmo senza rigore, a calm, free allegro, a tempo designation which is perhaps a gesture to looming classical precedents such as Beethoven, who was notoriously fond of lengthy, evocative bits of Italian at the head of many of his later works. But what's immediately striking about the opening of the quartet is, and it'll be particularly evident, I think, in this acoustic, is the evocation of an ancient sound. The long-held pedal notes and the prominent octave doubling of the winding improvisatory melody suggest a church organ that has somehow mutated into a string quartet. Also improvisatory and also redolent of times, possibly Purcellian times past, is the fact that the movement is constructed out of severely limited musical material. In fact, it's basically, it compromises what we might call a variation on one interval, the interval of a tenth, an open sonority that begins each new melodic idea of this movement and that often underpins those ideas in the form of long-held pedal notes under the melody. Now, when after this beautiful meandering opening, the music eventually picks up pace and energy, it betrays, I think, a strangely brittle form of dynamism, one that in many ways grows out of the stasis that preceded it and follows the same obsessive intervallic patterns. The Britten analytical industry, perhaps inevitably, has wanted to stress the sonata form aspects of these movements, but it's certainly easier, if less elevating, to hear an essential tension not between tonal areas or contrasting themes in this first movement, but rather between the quartet medium as a single sonorous hurdy-gurdy-like instrument on the one hand, and on the other, in the faster sections, an unruly collection of four individuals constantly threatening to pull away from each other. What's clear, though, is by the end of the movement, the hurdy-gurdy finally triumphs. In a beautiful coda, the status of the opening, with its oh-so-resonant tenths, reappears in the three upper instruments, while a cello, pizzicato, and instructed to play like a harp, sketches some disarmingly simple cadences. Very beautiful, very relaxed ending. Now, after this complex, challenging play of opposites in the first movement, the second movement presents a sudden and even brutal contrast. There are clean-cut melodic lines and violent, stabbing chords. The Bernard Herrmann of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho might have been listening. There are also passages in which the entire quartet ensemble seems to be dancing, each part at a slightly different speed. Where, one wonders, is all this nervous energy coming from? Why such agitation? One speculation is that, in contrast to those famous Britten moments in Peter Grimes and elsewhere, in which nature is so tellingly evoked by his music, here we're confronted by an eerie, scurrying urban world in which machine-like gestures fragment any sense of the musical pastoral of the previous generation of English composers. Or to put this another way, it's as if the needle has somehow become stuck on an insubstantial figure from a Baroque dance movement, a figure that then gradually gains significance through continual mechanical, eerie repetition. At the end, the machine simply winds down and we're done. This is very short. This movement only lasts about 3.5 minutes with multiple question marks hanging in the air. If you search on the internet, you can find a recording of the Zarian Quartet who played the premiere of this in 1945, and they recorded it very soon afterwards. This second movement makes unbelievable technical demands, which are partly answered by the Zarian Quartet in their recording. I have this sort of image in the second movement of they're all putting on air raid helmets and hoping for the best. It's a really, really difficult movement to play. So, and to the third and last movement is called Chaconne, a chaconne, an overt homage to Purcell, who wrote several such movements, and it's the crowning glory of the quartet, and by far the longest movement. It lasts about 18 minutes, about half the entire quartet. It's composed of a theme and 21 variations, various subgroupings of which are separated from each other by elaborate solo cadenzas. Although there are wisps of thematic similarity to earlier ideas in the work, in gestural terms, this chaconne is utterly unlike anything that comes before. The stately octave unison opening is like a study in elongation, as though a single gesture, in itself a cadence and endpoint, has been enlarged under a microscope, again with the quartet as a single powerfully vibrating instrument. If you want my advice, and you're perfectly at liberty to disregard it, I wouldn't even try to count up all those 21 variations. You'll run out of fingers anyway. Britten makes anyway such structural listening particularly difficult by fashioning his theme as a 9-bar unit, creating an irregularity at the very basis of the work that serves continually to upset any sense of orderly progress. Instead, I would say listen on a larger scale to the alternations between solo passages and increasingly complicated ensemble textures, especially to the gradual accumulation of melodic detail in the slow motion explosion of Baroque ornamentation, turns, and particularly trills. In listening to such moments, one might again think of late Beethoven, in particular the way Beethoven's final movements tend to dissolve into airy trills. But coming as it does so soon after Peter Grimes, it might also be useful to think of this chaconne as in some way operatic, as an evocation which is strongest in a beautiful legato section about 2/3 of the way through. It's variation 16, in case, against my advice, you are counting. The instruments here in this little legato interlude are blissfully in parallel thirds and sixths, with shared trills and with the cello busy underneath with chordal pizzicatos again. It's almost as if a Rossinian love duet has suddenly entered this work. And finally, most surprising of all, in so many ways against the grain of the movement, and indeed the quartet as a whole, becomes a remarkable, hyper-affirmative ending to the quartet. The quartet is in C major, the home key of this movement, and the open sonorities which were explored so gently in the first movement, return here in huge gestures, massive chords pealing forth. Again, it'll be wonderful in this acoustic. It's almost as if after being so many other things, of being a hurdy-gurdy, of being an organ, of being a single complex vibrating instrument and so on, the string quartet here at the close of the work strives to become something different, like a huge celebratory orchestra. After the equivocation of the first movement and the eerie violence of the second movement and the stately progress of that third movement, chaconne, suddenly and against the odds, we seem to have arrived somewhere. A victory or perhaps a homecoming is grandly declared. Now, as so often with Britten, we can propose, if we want, decodable musical meaning for this quartet, but we do so, I think, very much at our peril, or rather at risk of a diminishment of the music, which in so many ways defies simple interpretation. To take the most obvious example, does this work have something to say about the period of its composition? Is it a post-war parable of sorts? The frequent references to Purcell and, by extension, to a moment in which British musical culture had a figure of international stature might, as I discussed earlier, seem patriotic, and certainly it's easy to hear the triumphal ending as I said, a celebration or at least a release of sorts. All this is surely consonant, and richly so, with England in 1945. I also wonder about the alienating sense of mechanicity in the second movement, so redolent of wartime rhetoric about what was so terrible about this war was the way that machines had taken over. I also wonder about the constant shifting identity of the quartet. What was the place, you see, this quartet seems to be asking, what was the place of this ensemble in the new world, this unimaginably strange and new world that was emerging after 1945? Could something as traditional as the string quartet even exist, or should its whole identity be called into question? Now, such stories, in one sense invited by the music's contrasts and multiple manners, are at the same time made somehow more fragile by the sheer complexity of the musical surface, the ambiguity of its effect. Perhaps it's time then for the words to stop and for the music, at once so haunting and so resistant to being pinned down, to take up the story. Here then to play for you Britten's String Quartet No. 2 is the Badke String Quartet. Please join me in welcoming them. Tamsin Waney-Cohen is first violin, Emma Parker second violin, John Thorne viola, and Jonathan Byers cello.